Have you ever wondered how to edit these dramatic weather images? Let me show you how to do that using a little bit of Lightroom editing. As always, if you want to follow along, you can find a link to download all the raw files in the description of this video. And now let's begin. So in this video, we are going to work with a panoramic image. That means first we need to merge it. Down here you can see all the images we are going to use. So select them all, right click, go to Photo Merge and choose Panorama. I am going with the cylindrical projection for this image because it looks the best to me. However, you can try using the spherical one if you prefer that. Now I'm not going to use any boundary warp, I'm not going to fill the edges. All I want to do is to hit the merge button right away. Okay, and we will end up with an image that looks like this. The reason why I did shoot a panoramic image here is to capture all of this cloud formation going from left to right. So next up, we want to crop the image to get rid of all these gaps. So let's do that. I'm going to take away a little bit from the sky. I'm also going to rotate it slightly to make the horizon look even, just like this. Then let's take a bit away from the bottom part. This is not that interesting. And then let's take away a bit from the right and the left. I want to keep the path nicely centered, so this is looking very, very good. Now I did mess up the exposure a little bit, so the first thing I want to do is to try and fix that. I'm going to change the profile to Adobe Standard. This will help lessen the contrast a little bit, and then right away let's bring down the exposure and see what this does. So I only want to drop it very slightly to not introduce any underexposure, and I also don't really want to change the foreground too much because I think the foreground looks great. It's more about the sky. So for that reason, I also want to bring down the highlights because we do have a lot of highlights in the sky. As you can see, bringing those down will help reveal more of that cloud structure. And I think I want to slightly bring up the blacks. Okay, let's see if we can rotate it a little more because I don't think the horizon is even at the moment, so that should help. Now exposure wise it looks much better. We do have some overexposure on the right side. That's unfortunately not fixable. I think I'm going to use it in another way later on. But for now I'm quite happy with how this is looking. I also want to introduce some texture, giving this image some more sharpness. I also want to add clarity. And I want to introduce some dehaze for more contrast. Now for these kind of weather images, the sliders down here in the presence tab are really important. You're gonna see it in a minute. First, let me also introduce some vibrance and some saturation just to make this image a little more colorful. Wonderful. We can take a look at before real quick and you can see not that much has changed except for stronger colors, and we can see more of that cloud structure in the sky. However, in this case, it's really important to target areas of the image locally. We want to treat the sky different than we treat the foreground. So we're going to use masks for that. And to give you a great example of how we can do that is let's create a linear gradient. And with this linear gradient, we want to roughly cover the sky. So pretty much like this. What I'm going to do now is to bring down the exposure, and this will change the image dramatically. Right away, this looks much better, but we can further tweak it. For cloud formations like this, we want to work a lot with contrast. We want to make the darker parts darker and those bright parts shining from behind the clouds, we want to make them brighter. So we can simply do that by bringing up the contrast. But what really helps in this case is let's go down again into the effects tab, and here we want to bring up the clarity a lot and see how this adds a lot of punch to that cloud. We can even add a little bit of texture if we want, making this a little sharper. And you could also experiment a bit with dehaze if you want. So due to these changes right here, we might end up with a little bit of noise in the sky. Luckily for us, we don't really need those sharp clouds. So what we can do is to add a little bit of noise reduction and kind of counter that problem this way. Perfect. Let's continue. I'm quite happy with the first linear gradient, but let's add another one on top. This time I only want to cover the very top part here. And what I'm going to do here is to further improve the contrast, making the very top darker by bringing down the shadows. And I'm bringing down the blacks. And you can see as we bring down the dark areas, the highlights behind that big fat cloud in the center are standing out more and more. And thus we're creating this very dramatic scene. You see, it's really easy to edit these kinds of images. Let's also work on the cloud itself. I'm going to use a simple radial gradient for that. And I'm just roughly covering the center like this. And what I want to do in here is to simply bring up the clarity a bit to further bring out the cloud's structure. That looks great. So we can further improve the look of the sky. I want to use a color range mask, and you can see some aqua-ish color tones shining through, and I want to target those. So I'm clicking right in here. Of course, at first this color range mask will select way too much. So we want to use the refine slider, bring it down all the way. See how we get a pretty good selection this way. And what I want to do with this is to bring up the saturation just a little bit. We could maybe also slightly bring up the highlights, adding more contrast, but here I would be very careful. Wonderful. Then let's see if we can kind of use that overexposure in the right area. I'm going to use a radial gradient for that, and I'm making it white but very thin, just covering the brightest part right here. And I want to use the overexposure to add some kind of glow coming in from behind that field. I'm going to do that by bringing up the blacks. And I'm going to drop the dehaze. This kind of makes the overexposure a little softer and just not that obvious. I could also try to bring down the highlights a little more in this case, just to reduce that bright spot a bit. Okay, so I think we can work a little more on the sky. Let me create one more linear gradient covering most of the sky like this again. And I'm going to bring up the contrast once more, maybe like that. And I do think I want to bring down the blacks, further pushing the contrast. All right, that looks awesome. And of course, let's not forget the foreground. I'm using another simple linear gradient covering most of the foreground like that. I guess you could be a little more precise using something like a color range mask or an inverted sky selection, but I don't think that matters this much here. I also want to give the foreground more punch, so I'm going to simply raise the contrast. I'm also going to bring down the shadows slightly. And at this point, there might be a little underexposure, so I want to bring up the blacks to fix that. And then let's also bring up the clarity, giving more structure to the foreground. Perfect. Now there's just one more thing I want to do. I want to add a radial gradient for the center like this. And I want to introduce some bright spot right here in the center. So I'm going to bring up the whites a lot, just to make this area more interesting, pulling in the viewer's eye in this area. And at the same time, I'm going to bring down the blacks for more contrast. Perfect. So that's pretty much it for the masking. And the masks for this image make a huge difference. I can show you the image from before with just our base settings applied to after with this masking stuff added on top. And thanks to the masking and adding contrast to the sky, we create this very dramatic weather scene. Now we can do a little bit of color grading to finish the edit, so let's head out of the masking, go into the color mixer. There's actually not much going on. I do want to slightly bring down the green saturation, while I'm going to increase aqua and blue just a little bit. And I'm also going to head down into the calibration tab. And here, let's bring down the blue primary hue and push the saturation some more. Okay, that looks awesome. Now the only thing left to do, let's also check the remove chromatic aberration real quick. That's something I always do for all my images. And then we can sharpen this image in the details tab. So bring down the radius, increase the details, add some masking while holding down the Shift key so only the important areas will get sharpened, and then increase the amount of sharpening. Done. And here we have the finished image. I'm quite happy with the results. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments as well. And thank you so much for watching this video.